Here is an SOS message from Morrison. Please inform Robert Morrison, second engineer on the steam trawler Isabella Gregg, that his mother, Agnes Morrison, is dangerously ill.
We're over to you, Birmingham.
Birmingham's over to you, Manchester.
Manchester's over to you, Leeds.
Leeds is over to you, Newcastle.
National programme from London. Now you're going to hear the first performance of the new BBC Dance Orchestra, directed by Henry Hall.
It's just the time for dancing. Tomorrow is today. Go where the music.
It's an impossible thing for anybody to understand who wasn't born before that time or alive and working in that time, you know. A time when there were horse-drawn buses still, when there were trams, you know, when there were wooden pavements. And out of that, I was suddenly jumped into something which was so entirely different that you didn't realize what on earth had happened, you know. Here was something which suddenly made it unnecessary for you to go to the concert. You hadn't got to go to the theatre. You hadn't got to go to the football match. You hadn't got to go anywhere. You could sit, and the thing would come to you.
The invention that brought words and music out of the air was the wireless.
The government were pressured to start up a broadcasting organisation of some sort to give a service over the country. They didn't really know how to do it or what to do.
The pressure came from the wireless manufacturers, who planned to establish a radio network in Britain so that people would buy their sets. With government backing, they launched the privately owned British Broadcasting Company. The first broadcast went out from Marconi House in London in November 1922. The station was known as 2LO.
2LO, Marconi House, London, calling. 2LO, Marconi House, London, calling.
The first sets were a novelty and drew crowds to listen. Early radio was considered eccentric and unpredictable. To receive a broadcast, you needed a crystal set fashioned from metal wire called a cat's whisker and a crystal the size of a large pea. Or, if you could afford it, an early radio receiver. There was an estimated audience of around 30,000 listeners, and the range was only 40 miles.
Imagine, reduce the staff of the BBC to 4 people today and say, put on a programme, you see. What happens? Nobody knows what to do. You know, you finish sorting through the letters at 5 o'clock and you clap on your hat and run down the road to get to the studio, which is in the Gaiety Theatre, get in the lift and go up, open the mic, and you're in the children's hour. What do? You improvise. Nobody knows what to do, you know. So we make it all up.
The man who thought he did know what to do was John Reith, who was appointed general manager, later the first director general of the BBC.
Well, the first impression was that he was terrifying to look at, because he was 6'7" or something and had this terrific wound on his face and very craggy, and a sort of rather short Scottish way of speaking, which was rather terrifying. But that was first impression, because I got awfully fond of him, as everybody who worked with him got very fond of him. One of the marvellous things about him was that he expected more of you than you thought you could give.
He had standards. He believed in quality. He believed seriously in the religious aspect of life, and Sundays were sacred and Sundays were sacrosanct, and he wouldn't have it messed about with. And so he really set standards for the BBC, which they've never really lost in a way. They built on this pedestal of what he laid down.
The heavens declare the glory of God. And the
Reith told his staff always to keep on the upper side of public taste. His mission was to make broadcasting a moral force, not only to entertain, but also to educate and inform. To Reith, this meant unqualified support for the establishment. The 1926 general strike brought the country to a standstill. The only means of communication was the BBC. Winston Churchill, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, told the cabinet it would be monstrous not to use such an instrument to our advantage.
I had an interview with the Prime Minister the next morning. Stanley Baldwin was on the other side of the table from us, walking up and down, smoking a pipe, and I was making a passionate appeal that the government should leave the BBC alone. And trust to me, that's what it came to, I suppose. And he said to me, actually, I'm going to put this to the Cabinet in terms of trusting the managing director. Is that all right? I said, yes, fine.
The BBC remained free of formal control, but Reith broadcast what the government wanted. The Conservatives used the radio to denounce the strikers, while the trade union leaders were barred from broadcasting direct to the public. The Labour Party maintained that the BBC had broken the strike. It had represented only one side of the story and had broadcast government propaganda. Later that year, Reith reluctantly accepted a knighthood. By the early 30s, the BBC was uniquely established by Act of Parliament as the British Broadcasting Corporation, funded by a licence fee, with a brand new headquarters, Broadcasting House, in London's West End.
The BBC was efficient, and the people working particularly on the programmes I'm talking now about believed profoundly in the influence of broadcasting. They came there and nowhere else, not because they were better paid or anything of that sort. I'm talking about the early days, because they believed profoundly and felt a sort of a call to it.
Programmes could now be heard by up to 17 million people on both the national and regional networks. The staff was dedicated to serving the BBC as a national institution, which quickly established its own somewhat eccentric traditions.
Have you trouble with mice in here, please?
No.
Thank you.
London's Queen's Hall. You're listening to Wagner's immortal overture, The Master Singers, played by the BBC Symphony Orchestra, conducted by Sir Adrian Boult.
This is Henry Hall speaking. The BBC Dance Orchestra is going to play to you Piccadilly Ride.
Music, classical, light and popular, represented nearly 2/3 of the weekly output. By the mid-30s, the BBC had its own symphony and dance orchestras. Henry Hall was perhaps the best known of the radio band leaders.
My early memories of radio when I was at school was that quite a lot of the girls were terribly keen on Henry Hall, and he was the BBC Dance Orchestra, and they swooned when he said, "This is Henry Hall, good night." They sort of went emotional, and they wrote fan letters to him, and it was extraordinary, really, when they couldn't see him.
You are hearing the signature tune of the BBC Dance Orchestra. The tune is called It's Just a Time for Dancing.
Henry Hall, in particular, had a very easy style, very intimate, that he, speaking to you and to you alone. And, of course, it was a good show. And then you had these very popular dance bands.
Music has gotta be sweet, and music has gotta be hot as can be.
Geraldo, people like that, just you had on the other side of the Atlantic, because it was the days of the good band of a medium size, most of whom used to play at London hotels or occasionally in a nightclub where people went to eat and dance. It's a different world.
What's the modulation like on the regional?
The London nightclubs provided a regular source of entertainment for listeners to the BBC.
The first artist in our programme is Nina Mae McKinney.
And, thanks to the wireless, for the first time, cabaret stars became household names.
News is spreading about our wedding. I hear church bells ringing. Here's the song my heart keeps singing. Dinah, is there anyone finer?
Despite the seductive appeal of many of the programmes, Reith ran the BBC with a rod of iron, imposing his own moral code on those who worked beneath him.
Miss Freeman, the women's staff administrator, used to stand in the entrance hall of Broadcasting House in the morning, and if any young woman arrived without stockings, she was sent home to put them on.
Other staff members were dismissed for lapses in moral conduct. Peter Eckersley, the BBC's chief engineer since the early 20s, was sacked by Reith for having an affair with a married woman. Attempts to keep a well-known violinist off the air were made by the Director General.
In came this enormous figure and said, "Daisy Kennedy's on the air tonight." So I said, "Is she, sir? I didn't know." He says, "You consider yourself fit to be director of programs in this company, and you allowed this woman to appear tonight?" I was completely fuzzed. I said, "Oh, really, I don't know. Why not, sir? Haven't you seen in the papers? She's been divorced."
Reith even concerned himself with the personal lives of his staff announcers.
He was awfully handsome, young announcer, and I really, was quite taken with him from afar. And I suddenly heard that he was going to be dismissed. And I asked one or two people what was the reason for this, and they were rather cagey about it, evasive. And so I asked Sir John. I couldn't understand it because he was so good, and it seemed, it upset me. So he said, "Well, I'm afraid he's a homosexual." So I said, "Well, what's that?" And so, it's an extraordinary thing to say, but I had no idea. And he explained it to me most gently.
They're bringing her in a straight dead line in front of us now.
Critics complained that the BBC's programmes were rather patronising. A middle-class institution reporting with middle-class voices on middle-class activities.
There goes the flag. Cambridge approach the finishing post.
Here we are, operatic gems.
On the beach, great seals lay basking.
It was the King's English only, and no regional accents were allowed.
Shoals of fish came up to hearken.
This is the national program from London. We begin this evening with a concert by the Gershwin Parkinson Quintet, who will play Liebestraum, Love's Dream by Blitz.
I'm sorry if local dialects are disappearing. I can still talk myself as broad Glasgow as anybody you would hear, do you see? But I don't think I should talk that on the wireless.
The Daily Express published an open letter to the BBC.
Many of the gentlemen who give talks deliver their sentences as if they were committing them to the grave.
Journalist Maurice Gorham described this time at the BBC as the era of the stuffed shirt. He wrote,
"Paternalism run riot, bureaucracy of the most hierarchical type, an aloofness, a resentment of criticism, and a positive contempt for the listener."
With the new disc recorder, the BBC began to get out and about to describe the lives of ordinary people for the first time.
Here is a porter, and I'll ask him to describe his work. We get out of bed just after 3 o'clock in the morning, get to the market about 4:30, find out where our consignments are and start bringing the packages into the market. Take the lids off so that the customers can see the fish, as they are very particular these days.
New sound effect techniques were brought in to keep the listeners interested. But the greatest new technique of all was adding pictures to the sound.
Hello, Radio Olympia. This is direct television from the studios at Alexander Palace.
BBC Television, the first regularly scheduled service in the world, began in 1936.
And now we're going to see and hear someone you know well, Miss Helen Mackay.
With early audiences of only 300 viewers in Greater London, the television pioneers were looked down upon by their radio colleagues who thought that television would never last.
I think we were felt, especially at first, to be a considerable nuisance. various directors and bigwigs came along and looked at it, and they all muttered what an untidy lot we were. But generally speaking, the BBC attitude was hostile and suspicious and cautious. They couldn't think that it had any future, that it was probably misleading people to let them think it had, and a waste of time to take it up.
Everybody's got to do it, and believe me, you won't rue it when your television set comes home. When those old school Thai announcers take their place before the mic, you'll see if they enjoy pronouncing English as they like. The voice you fell in love with in the days it used to be. You'll gaze upon her features, and I wonder what you'll see. A dear old thing of 20 stone and cross-eyed possibly, when your television set comes home. There'll be fashion shows on Mondays, girls in frocks and girls in undies when your
television sets were expensive, the range was limited, and the screens were only 10 inches wide. Television was a novelty, and in the 30s the radio remained king. When George V died, the Director General himself decided to announce the news in person over the radio.
This is London. His Majesty the King passed peacefully away at a few minutes before 12. We offer profound sympathy to Her Majesty the Queen and the royal family. We affirm our loyalty to the Crown.
Reith, who did not see the BBC as the nation's newspaper, refused to report King Edward VIII's affair with American divorcee Wallis Simpson, even after the press and the world's newsreels had broken their silence.
By the Church of England and the upper classes. They are bitter in opposition to the king marrying the American woman twice divorced.
But it was through the BBC that the world heard of the abdication of the king. Reith himself made the introduction to Edward's broadcast.
This is Windsor Castle. His Royal Highness Prince Edward.
A few hours ago, I discharged my last duty as King and Emperor. And now that I have been succeeded by my brother, the Duke of York, my first words must be to declare my allegiance to him.
Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's policy of appeasing Hitler was treated with deference by the BBC. It did little to air alternative views, even though there were voices in the country ready to protest. Churchill was almost alone amongst political leaders in advocating a firm stand against the Nazis. But Reith refused to allow him to air his views on the BBC, something Churchill never forgot.
In all its forms, and especially in the highest form.
In February 1938, Labour MP Josiah Wedgwood wrote a talk on the dangers of fascism. It was turned down by the BBC. Director of talks Richard McConaughey wrote,
"We do not feel justified in allowing the great publicity of the microphone to be given to such sweeping charges."
Even when Hitler occupied part of Czechoslovakia later that year, the BBC, following the government lead, continued the appeasement line. Worse, it kept off the air those who were prepared to speak out. Conservative MP Harold Nicolson was refused permission to refer to the Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia in his weekly broadcast. Nicolson was later told that his script had been personally vetoed by the Foreign Secretary. In a secret internal memo dated the 5th of October 1938, radio news editor John Coatman accused BBC management of a conspiracy of silence. John Reith had left the BBC earlier that year to become chairman of Imperial Airways, before the collapse of Chamberlain's policies had become apparent. His achievement was to have created a BBC founded on public service broadcasting, with assured finance and protected by the brute force of monopoly.
My work was finished. The organization was there, the discipline, the interest, the enthusiasm, the dedication. Gosh, what a word to be able to use. The dedication. I thought I had got a good organization, one that would stand up to anything, including war.
Now Reith's BBC faced its greatest challenge, to become the voice of the whole nation in time of war.
This is the BBC Home Service. Here is a short news bulletin. The German army invaded Holland and Belgium early this morning by land and by landings from parachutes. The armies of the Low Countries are resisting.
The great thing that's required in any war, of course, is news, news, news. There's an insatiable demand for news. After all, life is at stake. You know, husbands and sons and brothers are out there risking their lives, and people at home want to know what's happening. How's it going? How's it moving? So news is what is required more than anything else.
On the 10th of May 1940, Winston Churchill became Prime Minister. Within a month, he faced the disaster of the shattered Allied armies retreating from Dunkirk. The BBC followed the government line in transforming the tragedy of defeat into a miracle of deliverance. The writer, J.B. Priestley, created a radio legend about the small ships of Dunkirk.
This little steamer, like all her brave and battered sisters, is immortal. She'll go sailing proudly down the years in the epic of Dunkirk. And our great-grandchildren, when they learn how we began this war by snatching glory out of defeat and then swept on to victory, may also learn how the little holiday steamers made an excursion to hell and came back glorious.
The Prime Minister used the BBC to inspire the nation.
Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. We can stand up to him, all Europe may be freed, and the life of the world may move forward into broad, sunlit uplands. But if we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, including all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age, made more sinister and perhaps more protracted by the lights of perverted science.
He was God's gift to radio. He knew the first rule that you had to talk to one person, not a million. In millions of homes up and down these islands and elsewhere too, nothing happened but listening to the wireless whilst Churchill was on. The records of water companies, telephone companies, gas suppliers, electricity suppliers showed the demand going down, 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 and to nothing during that few minutes of Churchill's broadcast. Nobody went to spend a penny, nobody put the kettle on, nobody used the telephone, nobody did anything but sit there listening to Winston.
Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duty. So bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its commonwealths last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
Television closed down and the whole nation was bound together by the wireless.
Official information and instruction will be given over the wireless. When you hear the warning signals...
The government used the BBC to broadcast public information. Auntie would tell the nation what to do.
Keep pencil and paper by your wireless set.
The Ministry of Home Security warns all civil defense and ARP services to be on the alert. The ministry states that the carrying of gas masks by the public has once more become necessary.
Churchill sought greater controls over broadcasting. He feared that an independent BBC could not always be trusted to follow the government line, and he considered taking over the corporation.
Remember, even Churchill used to speak about the BBC as the enemy within the gate. There were plenty of powerful voices within the government, within Parliament, and outside, who thought that in wartime the BBC should be a branch, a department of the Ministry of Information, and that it should openly be regarded as the voice of the government, the voice of Britain.
The Prime Minister even questioned the patriotism of the BBC. He described it dismissively as one of the major neutrals. He decided against a formal takeover, but there were still many ways in which the government could influence what was broadcast. Director of Home News Patrick Ryan reported straight to the Ministry of Information. Every morning, he received a government briefing.
He was a civil servant from say 10 o'clock in the morning till 12 noon and a BBC person for the rest of the day. But it was an extremely clever way of meeting the government's wishes and making sure that what the government wanted the BBC to do got done. The BBC wasn't independent. You couldn't expect it to be in wartime. The press wasn't independent either. Remember that censorship existed. Every word the BBC put out was censored both for security and for policy.
Top of the bill, number 23.
The BBC band leaders soothed the nation, but the wireless also brought news of the darker side of war.
St. Paul's Cathedral was the pivot of the main fire. All around it, the flames were leaping up into the sky. There the cathedral stood, magnificently firm, untouched in the very center of all this destruction. Men were fighting the fires from the top of 100-foot ladders, shot up from the street. Others were pushing their way into the burning buildings, taking the jet to the core of the fire. There was a vast number of men there, and apart from occasionally helping to lay out a hose, I saw that there was nothing I could do to help.
Hitler planned to terrorize Britain by bombing its cities. The Blitz posed the greatest problem of the war so far for the BBC. How to report death and destruction on the doorstep without destroying morale.
Nothing was allowed to go on the air which would give rise to disaffection. Nothing was allowed to go on the air which would have the effect of lowering the spirits of the people and affecting our cause.
Music while you work, we played to you this morning on Rhythmic Records.
A BBC memo instructed,
no slow foxtrots, dreamy numbers or vocals of the sob stuff order, plenty of snap and punch. Just try to make the period one of unrelieved brightness and cheeriness.
The purpose was to keep them happy and working, because if they were happy, they'd work well. If they were depressed, they wouldn't work well. So they played this happy melody. And music while you work, and workers' playtime, of course, that was something to look forward to cheer them up.
Minister of Labour Ernest Bevin gave his full backing to the BBC's idea of taking entertainment straight to the factory canteen.
Ladies and gentlemen, workers' playtime.
I'm a guy who's never going to roam again once I'm in the old hometown.
By and by I'll see my little home again, then I'm going to settle down
round the back of the armchair. Now this on love.
Workers' Playtime was praised by Bevin as a great contribution to production. He went further. The BBC is a factory of entertainment and must be regarded as one of the vital services. He recognized that what the wartime listener wanted was to be entertained.
Everybody there, a jolly good time. While the band along goes by, everybody
welcome that man again.
Itmar, starring Tommy Handley, was the most popular BBC comedy of the war, with a weekly audience of 16 million listeners.
This is my uncle out in the middle stump. Yes, no.
Itmar stood for It's That Man Again. It's That Man Again came from a thundering 72-point newspaper headline every time Hitler invaded somewhere else or did yet another speech to say something was his last demand and wasn't. Always, It's That Man Again. Except this minute, It's That Man Again is Tommy Handley. They just pitched the idea.
If it isn't Canteen Clara, the whistle-smacking bomber. I say, you look a bit tousled. Have you flown off the handle?
No, sir. I've been fire watching for the first time.
Do you have a chaperone?
Oh, yes, sir. And a very nice, polite chap he was, too. Always said pardon before he took his boots off.
You couldn't find anybody who didn't know the catchphrases. I mean, whether it's a judge in the courtroom or a garbage collector or bus conductor.
Can I do you now, sir?
I was hoping to get home before it started. I wanted to hear it, and the train was late or something, and so I was walking from the station back to my home along sort of residential roads, and it was in the summer and the windows were open, and I hardly missed a word of it, you know. In every house I went by, Itmar was on. It had a tremendous binding together effect.
Come on, you jolly jobhead! Laugh with me!
I think the comedians all felt in their own hearts and their own guts that it was a fight. And their weapon was wit, be it satire, be it fairly crudish, simplistic jokes. But every one of them, on the halls and indeed on the air, came out with an anti-Hitler joke.
That moustache you got won't save you when the Jewish barber shave you. Old man Sickle Grubber, what are you going to do? Oh, old man Sickle Grubber, you're going to lose the rubber. Your doom's coming, you know that it's true. Old man Sickle Grubber, we're going to make you blubber.
The humour of the comedians made the country feel better, but the war was going badly. The greatest disaster at home was the first large-scale Allied raid across the Channel on Dieppe. Frank Gillard was with the invading force.
We knew that there was a terrific fight going on there behind that curtain of smoke, so near to us. But it was the war in the air which naturally held our attention most. We hadn't been in position long before dive bombing started. 2 Ju-88s came roaring down. Their target was obviously a destroyer just 100 yards or so from us. I saw their bombs, 2 sticks of 4, falling against the blue sky.
We never truly got ashore at Dieppe. We took over 5,000 men that morning, and late that afternoon we returned with only 1,250. We left the remainder behind us, killed, wounded, or prisoners of war, and 1,000 of them were killed, and the sea ran red with blood. Bodies were were being washed back towards us. We hauled wounded men out of the water and rescued them, pulled them up onto our craft. You know, my uniform was stained with the blood of other people, caked with it. The Canadian commander who planned the operation said at the end of the day, "I'm afraid this will go down in history as one of the greatest military disasters of all time," and he was absolutely right.
Wave after wave of our fighters and bombers came out, received their orders from the headquarters ship, and then went in to support the men on the land. We could see them strafing the coastal defences, destroying communications, and making low-level attacks on the enemy. As a combined operation, this raid was an all-time model.
The report that one was allowed to go on the air with, you know, concerned almost entirely the air action that was going on above our heads the whole time. And that was the only thing I could talk about, really. Everything else was heavily, heavily censored. And that is why I feel ashamed now, when I think back to the event, that I was not able to tell the true story of Dieppe to people. And I read in BBC literature about my memorable report from Dieppe. To me, it's memorable in all the wrong ways. It's memorable with shame. and disgrace, that I was there as the BBC's one and only eyewitness, and I couldn't tell that story as I ought to have told it.
After the rain, the sun will dry all
After nearly 2 years of fighting, everywhere the Allied armies were demoralized and still on the defensive. The BBC produced its weapon to cheer up the fighting men, the force's sweetheart.
And our boys went into battle, glad for action at last. At home, the women have been waiting and praying. Whether you're in some foreign land or guarding our own shores, we'll be waiting. We'll keep the fire glowing and your favorite chair just where you like it. Your slippers ready to slip into. God bless you. Sincerely yours, Vera Lynn.
Sincerely Yours, the BBC's first record request programme, attracted over 1,000 letters a week, bringing together the forces all over the world and their families. Desperate for victory, Churchill appointed Bernard Montgomery to lead the 8th Army in North Africa, a new general with new ideas.
Monty was accustomed to broadcasting, very much accustomed, and determined that he would use this. He knew that everybody listened to what the BBC said, and he arrived in the desert, conscious of the need for news, for communications, for linking with the BBC.
I have ordered that all plans and instructions dealing with further withdrawal are to be burnt. We will stand and fight here. If we can't stay here alive, then let us stay here dead. I want to impress on everyone that the bad times are over.
The major battle was about to begin, and BBC war reporter Godfrey Talbot was with the 8th Army.
This is Godfrey Talbot here, and we're recording up forward in the desert, and we're standing at the side of a track. You can hear some of the vehicles going past on this track. And now we can see silhouetted one or two ridges away there at the very front, a little way beyond us. And there are a few clouds about, it's a starry night, but a few clouds. And you must forgive me if I'm shouting, because I'm shouting against the voices of British guns. We're up here with some of the batteries, just behind some of the very, very heavy guns, and there's a terrific barrage going on. Standing here in the moonlight, it's a most amazing panorama. There's a whole series of flashes. It's an almost unbroken barrage.
For the first time, the sounds of war and the brutal reality of battle were brought daily from the front line into the living rooms of those at home. On the 12th day of battle, the Allied armies had the Germans on the run.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're interrupting our advertised program in order to broadcast in a few moments a special Cardo communique.
Here's some excellent news which has come during the past hour. It says the Axis forces in the Western Desert, after 12 days and nights of ceaseless attacks by our land and air forces, are now in full retreat.
We have victory. A remarkable and definite victory. A bright gleam has caught the helmets of our soldiers and warmed and cheered all our hearts. Ah, this is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end. But it is perhaps the end of the beginning.
Both victory and humour were in the air. The BBC followed a government directive to make dirty cracks against the Germans in musical sketches wherever possible. Advice followed by the actor and singer Noel Coward.
Don't let's be beastly to the Germans when our victory is ultimately won. It was just those nasty Nazis who persuaded them to fight, and their Beethoven and Bach are really far worse than their bite. Let's be meek to them and turn the other cheek to them and try to bring out their latent sense of fun. Let's give them full air parity and treat the rats with charity.
Letters of complaint poured in. Why was the BBC broadcasting pro-German material? The Director General protested,
"I really would be much happier if pressure were brought to bear to cancel this song."
Oil and coal and everything they need, for their peaceable intentions can be always guaranteed. Let's employ with them a sort of strength through joy with them. They're better than us at honest manly fun. Let's let them feel their swell again and bomb us all to hell again. But don't let's be beastly to the Hun.
There were phone calls galore to the BBC, strong letters to the national press complaining that Noel Coward was suggesting being friendly with the Germans, etc. And this was a beautifully skillful, surgical, scalpel satire on our attitude to Germany. And these people had misread, misheard, misunderstood the entire point of Noel Coward's satire. And ultimately the BBC had to ban it.
The Allied armies were victorious in North Africa, but the Germans still occupied the greater part of Europe. From Bush House in London's Aldwych, the BBC broadcast abroad in every language of Nazi-occupied Europe. Their aim was to keep hope alive that the war would end in liberation and victory. To unnerve the German occupying forces, the BBC began its V for Victory campaign over the airwaves.
Now the V sign, and it's three dots and a dash in the Morse code. And this was something you could either put up the dots and dashes, or you could put up the V sign, or eventually you could use the opening motif of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, da-da-da-da. And that was a way of getting at the Germans.
It drove the Germans potty, literally. Because they couldn't do it, because in Germany, the word for victory is Sieg. And Beethoven didn't write anything for S.
This is Colonel Britton speaking to the V Army. Write up your V's again. You know, and I know, what it stands for. And so do the German troops and the Nazi agents. And they don't like it. So put up the V where they'll see it, as the sign of the V Army. Put it up tonight, and for the whole of this week. And beat out the V rhythm, too.
The BBC's French service broadcast for 5 hours a day. It brought the news from London and the voices of the free French commentators to German-occupied France.
For the resistant people, the BBC was as important as the air or water you live on, because it was not only our only link with our friends in England, whether they be French or British, but it was also our only link inside the country. We had to listen to the BBC because the censorship of all the media was very, very strict, and only the British were able to bring us news.
Charles de Gaulle had escaped to London in 1940. Through the BBC, he told the French not to give up hope.
General de Gaulle, without the BBC, could never have started. I mean, if he had not been given, not the freedom of the airways, but access to the BBC in June 1940, I cannot see how the Free French movement could have possibly developed. There is absolutely no doubt that the BBC created the Radio General, and that the Radio General knew how to exploit the new medium which was offered to him.
The D-Day message to the Allied armies from the commander of the invasion forces, General Montgomery, was broadcast by the BBC and heard all over the world.
The time has come to deal the enemy a terrific blow in Western Europe. I send my best wishes to every soldier in the Allied team. To us is given the honor of striking a blow for freedom which will live in history. And in the better days that lie ahead, men will speak with pride of our doings.
He used to say to me, using your microphone, I can be the first general in history who can speak to every soldier in his army, because all my men are listening to the BBC the whole time. And if I can record with you and the BBC puts it over the air, they will all hear me. And increasingly, one got him to see that broadcasting was an arm of warfare. And, you know, so broadcasting really was a fourth arm of warfare. You had land warfare, you had warfare on the sea, you had warfare in the air, you had the warfare for the hearts and minds of men and women all over the place, and broadcasting was one of the great instruments of getting at the hearts and minds of people.
I want every soldier to know that I have complete confidence in the successful outcome of the operations that we are now about to begin. Good luck to each one of you, and good hunting on the mainland of Europe.
With D-Day came the most ambitious of the BBC's wartime coverage. A daily programme, War Report, followed the news each evening and brought commentary direct from the battlefront to listeners ever more hungry for news. The BBC became ever more identified with the voices of its correspondents from War Report. What made this technically possible was the so-called midget recorder. It was like a wind-up gramophone and recorded on discs which lasted only 2 minutes. It weighed a hefty 40 pounds and was the BBC's first portable recorder.
Hello BBC, this is Frank Gillard here, recording just outside Tilly, a mile or two back from Tilly, on Friday morning from the 16th, during a barrage which is being laid down to prepare the way for an infantry attack on a small village just to the east of Tilly. In this barrage, we've got our 4.2-inch mortars, our field guns, our medium guns, all the guns of the fleet. The shells are whistling overhead now, just listen to them. I'm not certain if you can hear that high-pitched whistle. The whistle of the shell as it actually slips through the trees overhead here. I'm lying down at full length here in the cornfield. Just in the hedges around me, I can see many men taking shelter behind the banks wearing their steel helmets while the terrific barrage goes on around us.
I had to get all the facts in and at the same time try to bring in a bit of colour and to use my recording equipment as far as I could in order to bring in the sounds, the racket, the pandemonium of battle, the voices of the commanders, the voices of the troops, all the associated elements of atmosphere which built up the whole picture of what was happening on these fronts and bringing it right to the fireside at home.
The road into Tilly is a road of devastation. The farmhouses, the cottages, almost every building along the road, they're either gutted out or smashed up by shell fire. Burnt out tanks and cars and trucks were lying in the blackened hedges. Every yard of this road was shouting at you that it had been fought for bitterly. Suddenly, without quite knowing how, there we were, right in the middle of the little town. We'd breasted a slope, and there was Tilly before us down in a little dip, with a crossroads at the bottom.
The Allied air crews were now pounding German cities nightly. One of the BBC's best-known correspondents was Richard Dimbleby. He flew 20 sorties with the RAF over Germany.
And just then, another Lancaster dropped a load of incendiaries. And where, a moment before, there had been a dark patch of the city, a dazzling silver pattern spread itself. A rectangle of brilliant lights, hundreds, thousands of them, winking and gleaming and lighting the outlines of the city around them. As though this unloading had been the signal, score after score of fire bombs went down, and all over the dark face of the German capital, these great incandescent flower beds spread themselves.
By March 1945, there were 29 BBC war reporters operating from the front line in Europe and from the Far East. By now, their voices were well known. They wore army uniform and had been trained on assault courses and in parachuting, gunnery, signals and military intelligence. They lived as soldiers and were nicknamed the BBC Commandos. They risked their lives daily to bring reports from the thick of the action. There was a new realism in War Report. Now Allied casualties were described, not just the enemy's.
Just a few feet off the ground, pandemonium broke loose. The wicked snap of Spandau machine guns mixed with the slower bong of 20mm incendiaries for just a fraction of a second before they started pricking out their trademark in the thin skin of the glider. Things seemed to happen too quickly for me to take them all in at once. There was an explosion that appeared to be inside my head, the smell of burnt cordite. I went down on one knee. Something hot and sickly was dripping over my right eye and off my chin and all over my clothes. I saw my pal, Peter Cattle, lying on one elbow with blood making a spider web over his face. One of the men was on the floor, staring fixedly at nothing as one of his legs, rigid in front of him, was quivering in convulsions like a stricken eel. Even then, the bullets kept crashing through the wreckage. It didn't seem fair, but then there's no fair or unfair in airborne fighting.
On the 15th of April 1945, the Allies entered Belsen concentration camp. There they discovered 40,000 dead and dying. It was Richard Dimbleby's greatest challenge to find the words to describe the horror of what he saw, for a war report which he knew would shock the world.
Here, over an acre of ground, lay dead and dying people. You could not see which was which, except perhaps by a convulsive movement or the last quiver of a sigh from a living skeleton too weak to move. The living lay with their heads against the corpses, and around them moved the awful ghostly procession of emaciated, aimless people, with nothing to do and no hope of life. Women stood and squatted, stark naked in the dust, trying to wash themselves and to catch the lice on their bodies.
When the British troops entered Belsen concentration camp, Richard Dimbleby came in, and we felt like a man from a different planet. He came in gave us so much hope that we are not alone now anymore. That he came and the hope he gave us, and that people do know what happened to us, and we be able to maybe find our relatives, our beloved ones.
When Dimbleby's report reached the BBC newsroom, they did not believe him and refused to transmit it. When he threatened to resign, the report was broadcast. The full horrors of the Holocaust were now revealed for the first time. On the 4th of May 1945, the German forces in northwest Europe surrendered.
Very
great crowd has collected already. Thousands upon thousands of people gathered to share this historic day with the King and Queen.
Here they come. First Her Majesty the Queen, it comes into view. Then the King in the uniform of an Admiral of the Fleet. The two princesses standing on the balcony listen to the crowd.
My feelings on VE Day were something was missing from life. No one was shooting, there were no bangs. It's a silly thing to say, perhaps. I'm sure many people felt the same, and it was very strange to be still, for the air to be still, for the troops to be singing and not fighting. My feelings on VE Day were of something that was over. One was aware of something that had gone from life. But I was aware very much that the BBC radio had been a weapon of war, and a major weapon of war. There's no doubt about that whatever.
We may allow ourselves a brief period of rejoicing. Today is Victory in Europe Day. Tomorrow will also be Victory in Europe Day. Advance Britannia. Long live the cause of freedom. God save the King.
If we had lost the war, the BBC would have been blamed for a great deal of it. We won the war, and so the BBC received a lot of credit.
And so we come to the end of another programme played to you by the BBC Dance Orchestra, directed by Henry Hall. Goodbye, everyone. Goodbye.
By 1945, the BBC was known all over the world. At home, Auntie had established herself at the heart of the nation and in the affections of the people. The next decade was to see the BBC facing the new challenge of competition in the post-war world.
And also the end of the national programme for tonight. Good night, everybody. Good night.
Next Tuesday, 1945 to 1960, the coming of the television age, as the inside story of the BBC continues at the later time of 10:30 here on BBC One. Next tonight's 60s espionage adventure with Michael Caine in the Ipcress File.